Now, whatever he was, and as you know, he was a great many things, C.S. Lewis was, for me, first and foremost, the absolutely unforgettable friend. The friend with whom I was in close touch for over 40 years, the friend you might come to regard hardly as another human being, but almost as a part of the furniture of my existence. That is a very lovely little tribute to C.S. Lewis from his dear friend, Owen Barfield, a name that probably rings many fewer bells than Lewis's own. He was much less famous than Lewis, but he was profoundly important in Lewis's life and in the movement that we now call the Inklings. He was also close with J.R.R. Tolkien. And I've been waiting on this show to talk about him for a while because he's one of those guys that there's a little bit of anxiety for me even approaching it since he changed my life so profoundly. His first book, which is not what I'm going to talk about today, Poetic Diction. His first book was one that I found in a library in Oxford because Lewis himself kind of mentions it obliquely in the footnote of a book called Miracles that he wrote. And I found the thing that the footnote was about really interesting. And so I went and chased down this book, Poetic Diction, which is about the nature of language and the nature of poetry. And I just remember kind of poring over it with this incredible excitement, like how as if somebody else is sort of thinking about these things, it was sort of a lot of my own thoughts kind of weirdly reflected back at me. And in some ways, that's what I want to start with today, is talking about the nature of the relationships in the Inklings and what it must have been like to be discovering some of the things together that Barfield and Lewis and Tolkien were discovering together. Because we're eventually, I think, going to spend some time, maybe more than one episode, on this book, Saving the Appearances, which is the book I'm going to start talking about eventually today. Because it relates in a modern way to a lot of the issues that we raised when we were talking last week about the final book of Plato's Republic, these questions of objectivity and reality, right? What is the nature of objective reality? Can we ever know it? How can we know it? And so forth. And what things are objectively or subjectively true? Is the existence of the table, is that objective in the final sense of the word, in a way that the existence of truth and beauty is not, right? Or are these things both kind of real, although experienced in different faculties? These are questions that are raised and really beautifully addressed in Saving the Appearances. But just because this is somebody that not a lot of people will necessarily have met, I wanted to take some time to read both Lewis and Barfield on the subject of their friendship, because it was something that, really transformed Lewis's life. They met together, these two, while they were students at Oxford. We've talked before about Lewis's time at Magdalen College, Oxford, but we've also we haven't talked really about Barfield or his journey. He was at Wadham College, Oxford, another one of these. Oxford is divided into these different colleges which sort of operate semi-autonomously, but of course, especially for graduate students and for undergrads as well, it's very easy to become friends with and interact with others in different colleges. They became fast friends, and Barfield was instrumental in Lewis's conversion, which he writes about, throughout his work, but in Surprised by Joy especially. He talks about his bitterness against God after his experience in World War I, his injury in that war, and just his sense that basically the material world is all there is. It's self-sufficient, it's self-explanatory, and no God could possibly allow the things that we saw in World War I. And so when Lewis met Barfield, apparently he said something to the effect of, I reject God. And this was where he was when gradually Barfield's own, it must be said, rather kooky vision, supernatural vision of the world, which was intimately connected with this fellow Rudolf Steiner, who you may have heard of. There are now Rudolf Steiner schools. But Barfield's vision of the world began to help convince Lewis that it's not sufficient to refer just to a kind of material world, that there's just stuff. Because one of the things that Barfield was really wonderful at showing is that even our notion of stuff is actually incoherent unless we understand it to be filtered through a human consciousness. And if human consciousness has ordering power that refers to more than just the accidental nature of our brain chemistry, but rather to a higher order that is implanted in us, well, then you're really in trouble, because then you're the shadow of God God begins to loom. And so that was a core part of how Barfield, it's maybe reductive to say that Barfield evangelized Lewis or brought him to Christ. It was more that his, their intimate friendship and intellectual connection shaped and molded Lewis's mind so that he was ready to receive God. Because there were other aspects too. There was a famous long walk and talk with Tolkien on a walk called Addison's Way, or Addison's Walk, which was beloved of the writer Joseph Addison, which is why it's called that. I used to walk it all the time. It was part of my college, Magdalen, part of the grounds, and they had a long conversation. Lewis sort of gradually began to become a theist, which is to say he believed in a God, and he famously recounts how on a ride in his brother's sidecar to the zoo, he entered the car not believing that Jesus Christ was the Son of God and exited it believing that Jesus was the Son of God. So let's just examine a little bit more of the nature of this friendship before we get into saving the appearances. When you get home from vacation, you always have that experience of sort of rediscovering your home and like loving all the stuff that, oh yeah, and it's so nice. It's nice to come back home in some ways. And one thing I loved about coming home from my honeymoon was that my kitchen looks so great with all of its public goods products. And I really am not kidding about that. There's something very aesthetically pleasing about the way they package their stuff. And I think it represents, maybe this is what it is. It kind of communicates that what you're getting when you shop at Public Goods is a brand you can trust for really clean ingredients, just simple, good basics that you can use and feel good about. They are, they're not blended with a bunch of gross chemicals. You're not going to like use that stuff on your hand, their soap on your hands and feel like it's destroying your skin. The food that they sell is really healthy and delicious. I love their chocolate covered almonds. I'm really into a lot of their snacks. My cat loves their freeze dried duck nibs, which I love to say, freeze dried duck nibs. And yeah, just everything. I mean, really anything that you get there comes highly recommended. And as I say, you can trust them not to be sneaking a bunch of random crap into your stuff. So when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics or use the code heretics at checkout, that's PUBLICGOODS.com/heretics, you will get $15 off your first purchase with no minimum purchase. That's $15 of free stuff at publicgoods.com/heretics. Go check it out. One of the things we're going to have to reckon with as we start to talk about Barfield, besides the fact that he's less famous, although this may be connected, is we're also going to have to reckon with the fact that he's a much less cogent writer than Lewis was. I mean, and that's a high bar, to be fair, right? Lewis had this marvelous gift for simplicity without reduction, right? He had this incredible power of distillation. He was able to speak in plain terms and nevertheless to convey incredibly complex ideas, many of them cribbed or summarized from the Greek philosophers. He had this degree in classics. He was very extraordinarily well read, a scholar of the medieval era, all sorts of literary and intellectual accomplishments, but in addition had this amazing power of communication. Barfield, the same cannot be said. His writing is very dense. It's got a lot of untranslated foreign languages in it, and that prevents, I think, a lot of people from getting into it in the same way. If he had had the expressive capacities of a Lewis, he certainly would be, I think, just as beloved now, or at least as much fun to read. But I say this by way of introducing the idea that although I read that quote at the beginning from Barfield about Lewis's friendship, I'm now going to read some quotes from Lewis about friendship in general, because I think he expresses it best. And I've talked about friendship quite a bit on the show before. I've mentioned that it is a virtue in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. That is to say, it's an excellence of being human to be good friends, to be true friends with somebody, which has to do with common orientation toward some shared excellence, not that you can get something out of somebody, not that you get pleasure out of their company all the time, but that you share a third good toward which you orient one another, right? And you help one another to seek and discover that good. And this is when you encounter it, it's a profoundly beautiful thing. It is a kind of love, as Lewis was famous for reiterating throughout his career. And as a kind of love, although not a sexual or an erotic love, it has an arresting kind of power. I often say, people say, oh, your friends are your chosen family, right? You choose your friends. You don't choose your family, but, you choose your friends. And I'm not entirely sure that's true. I don't think we do choose our friends. I think we fall in love with our friends. We don't fall in love with them. Again, it's not like, I have to make these disclaimers because people are always saying like, oh, Frodo and Sam, they're secretly gay because they blah, blah, blah. Or, those two guys are really affectionate with each other. They must be trying to get in each other's pants or whatever. And in fact, Lewis himself was dealing with that already in his book, The Four Loves. So this is a perennial kind of jibe or taunt. But it's much more profound than that. We fall in love with our friends with the love that is appropriate to friendship. And, I've talked before about, I think a lot of people are starving, men especially are starving for this kind of love. It's much like romantic love. It is found not by setting out to find it, but by embracing or throwing yourself into some pursuit. Because if true friendship is about the love of a shared good, then you're not going to find it by, trying to ingratiate yourself with some such person. You're going to find it by loving a good, right? By throwing yourself into church or by joining a professional association or a league or whatever. And eventually, right, these relationships do grow, although they are much more rare than we let on. We talk about, oh, my friend or my acquaintance or whatever, and we kind of cheapen that word by throwing it around. And look, there's nothing wrong with, with acquaintances and people you like and hanging out with people. Those can be very wonderful and can often grow into true friendship. But, for me, at least, true friendship is very rare. There's a few people that I would count among these, this kind of purest, highest Aristotelian friendship. So let me read to you a little bit from Lewis's Four Loves about friendship, and then you'll understand why Barfield is important, almost as important for his relationship with Lewis as for his own work, even though his own work is also mind-breakingly good. And there's almost no distinction, as you'll soon see, between the two ideas, between the influence on another and between the relationship the two of them had and between the work that they each did individually. So Lewis writes, Lamb says somewhere that if of three friends, A, B, and C, A should die, then B loses not only A, but A's part in C, while C loses not only A, but A's part in B. In each of my friends, there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out. By myself, I am not large enough to call the whole man into activity. I want other lights than my own to show all his facets. Now that Charles is dead, I shall never again see Ronald's reaction to a specifically Caroline joke. Far from having more of Ronald, having him to myself now that Charles is away, I have less of Ronald. Hence, true friendship is the least jealous of loves. Two friends delight to be joined by a third, and three by a fourth, if only the newcomer is qualified to become a real friend. They can then say, as the blessed souls say in Dante, here comes one who will augment our loves. For in this love, to divide is not to take away. Of course, the scarcity of kindred souls, not to mention practical considerations about the size of rooms and the audibility of voices, set limits to the enlargement of the circle, but within those limits we possess each friend not less but more, as the number of those with whom we share him increases. In this, friendship exhibits a glorious nearness by resemblance to heaven itself, where the very multitude of the blessed, which no man can number, increases the fruition which each has of God. For every soul, seeing him in her own way, doubtless communicates that unique vision to all the rest. That, says an old author, is why the seraphim in Isaiah's vision are crying, Holy, 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 to one another. The more we thus share the heavenly bread between us, the more we shall all have. This is one of the most beautiful passages in Lewis's writing. The insight about the angels in Isaiah is profound. The way that I have sometimes described this, and most often actually it's been in my relationship with my father, who is not related to me, so that's a little confusing, but there you have it. In my relationship with my father, we have said for a long time that there came a point in our relationship where we were not only just father and son, but friends, right? And I think, many every son has a intense and important relationship with his father, even if his father is absent, right? There's no escaping the importance of your father in your life. But many people have good relationships with their father and like their father and honor their father. But it's it's a stroke of luck to have in your father somebody who is also this kind of friend, somebody with whom you share a profound sensibility, an orientation toward the same things, right? Love of the same books, love of literature in and of itself. That's been really a great joy to us, and we often say that it becomes at a certain point difficult to tell where one person's thought ends and another person's begins. That's why I began by talking about this relationship between Barfield and Lewis, that once you start reading Barfield, you can find him in Lewis. And once you start reading Lewis, you can find him in Barfield. You can see that the boundaries between these two men's minds became rather porous. And when Barfield says of Lewis that he was that he was part of the furniture of his mind, I think that's also something like what he's trying to say there, that we interpenetrate one another in friendship, spiritually speaking, right? Our souls become kind of not indistinct from one another. We are still individuals, as Lewis kind of argues in that passage. But we nevertheless, it's hard to tell where the boundaries exactly are. I'm going to finish with one more paragraph from this section from the Four Loves before I move on and jump into Barfield. Friendship, writes Lewis, arises out of mere companionship when two or more of the companions discover that they have in common some insight or interest or even taste which the others do not share and which, till that moment, each believed to be his own unique treasure or burden. The typical expression of opening friendship would be something like, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." We can imagine that among those early hunters and warriors, single individuals, one in a century, one in 1,000 years, saw what others did not, saw that the deer was beautiful as well as edible, that hunting was fun as well as necessary, dreamed that his gods might be not only powerful but holy. But as long as each of these percipient persons dies without finding a kindred soul, nothing, I suspect, will come of it. Art or sport or spiritual religion will not be born. It is when two such persons discover one another, when, whether with immense difficulties and semi-articulate fumblings, or with what would seem to us amazing and elliptical speed, they share their vision. It is then that friendship is born, and instantly they stand together in an immense solitude. This is the relationship that Lewis had with Barfield for 40 years, right? And this idea, which is also in the Symposium, right, that friendship is generative, that it produces fruits, right, and that you are suddenly able, by kind of iron sharpens iron, as the Bible says, right. You are suddenly able to bring to fruition all of these things that would otherwise be just kind of private thoughts. Is a very beautiful idea, and it actually kind of helps inform the beginning of what I'm now going to start talking about with Barfield, because I'm now let's launch into this book, Saving the Appearances, which is about the nature of our perceptions and our relationship to reality. And this idea of interpenetration is going to become very important. This notion that, A has some part in B and B has some part in A, as Lewis puts it, and that this is true also of our relationship with the outside world, is really shatteringly important, I think, and something that, it makes me wish Barfield had been the writer that Lewis was, so that we would have as much kind of awareness of his work as we have of Lewis's. But let me start by reading kind of the opening of this book so that you can get a flavor for the kind of thing we're talking about. So it begins, Barfield begins by saying, consider a rainbow, right? Think of a rainbow in the sky and ask if it's really there. Because, of course, we know that rainbows are the effect of a certain configuration of light and water, right, on our perception when we're standing at a certain distance away. This is why Plato has been a good introduction for us to this, not only because Barfield was a careful reader of Plato, but also because, Plato was dealing in Book 10 of the Republic with exactly this problem. The artist gives you only a certain tableau, right, that is how the how the phenomenon might affect you, right? If you were standing in a certain position, but it doesn't give you the whole of the thing, right? And so Barfield says, okay, so let's just take that one thing, right? That perception, because if you got up close to the rainbow, it wouldn't be there. And yet, if other people were standing with you in the same position and we're sane and we're in possession of their faculties, they too would also perceive the rainbow. And so in answer, in some ways, to Plato's challenge, right, of, well, what does an artist give you? It's not anything real, right? It's just what you perceive when you're standing at a certain distance from a certain thing. He says, well, consider the rainbow. And now, says Barfield, look at a tree. It is very different from a rainbow. If you approach it, it will still be there. Moreover, in this case, you can do more than look at it. You can hear the noise its leaves make in the wind. You can perhaps smell it. You can certainly touch it. Your senses combine to assure you that it is composed of what is called solid matter. Accord to the tree the same treatment that you accorded to the rainbow. Recollect all you have been told about matter and its ultimate structure, and ask yourself if the tree is, quote, really there. I am far from affirming dogmatically that the atoms, electrons, nuclei, etc., of which wood and all matter is said to be composed, are particular and identifiable objects like drops of rain. But if the particles, as I will call them for convenience, are there, and are all that is there, then since the particles are no more like the thing I call a tree than the raindrops are like the thing that I call a rainbow, it follows, I think, that just as a rainbow is the outcome of the raindrops and my vision, so a tree is the outcome of the particles and my vision and my other sense perceptions. Whatever the particles themselves may be thought to be, the tree as such is a representation. And the difference for me between a tree and a complete hallucination of a tree is the same as the difference between a rainbow and an hallucination of a rainbow. In other words, a tree which is really there is a collective representation. The fact that a dream tree differs in kind from a real tree and that it is just silly to try and mix them up is indeed rather literally a matter of common sense. So he's saying, when you look at a rainbow, you say, well, really what's going on is there's raindrops and there's light, right? And if you get close to it, you'll find that it's just the raindrops. And he's saying, but you could also say that of a tree, because we're now saying in science, right, that a tree is just particles, right? It's just, and so every kind of perception and experience that we have, at least in our day-to-day lives, and we're going to get into our non-day-to-day lives in a second, in our day-to-day lives, every kind of perception that we have is that same experience of having an interaction, a relationship between something outside of us and its effect upon our senses. It's kind of like what I was responding to Plato last week. It's like, it's all that way. There's no getting away from it, even in the cold, supposedly austere beauty of calculation. So that's what we're going to get into in just a second. You would be nuts to try out hiring in this job market without Indeed. It really is a crucial tool for anybody that runs a business. What is the most important thing? You know this if you run a business, probably better than I do. The most important thing about a business is people, the people you serve and the people who help you to serve others. You need people that believe in your brand, that believe in the company culture you're trying to build, and who are competent and have the top line skills that are going to serve your mission best. All of that is super important, but you really don't want to have to rifle through giant sacks of resumes in order to find it. You probably won't be able to find the top-notch people at the same rate and with the same efficiency that you could if you used Indeed. They are the hiring partner where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. It's super convenient. They partner with you on every step of the hiring process, and you find great talent through time-saving tools like Indeed Instant Match, assessments, and virtual interviews. You can go to Indeed.com/heretics right now to claim a $75 sponsored job credit to upgrade your job post at Indeed.com/heretics. One more time, it's Indeed.com/heretics to claim your $75 job credit. All right, so let's take this one step further. We've talked about rainbows and raindrops. We've talked about trees and particles. And now Barfield sort of advances the ball. He says, if anyone likes to press the argument still further and maintain that what is true of the drops must also be true of the particles themselves, and that there is no such thing as an extramental reality, I shall not quarrel with him, but I shall leave him severely alone, because, as I say, this is not a book about metaphysics, and I have no desire to demonstrate that trees or rainbows or particles are not really there, a proposition which perhaps has not much meaning. This book is not being written because the author desires to put forward a theory of perception, but because it seems to him that certain wide consequences flowing from the hastily expanded sciences of the 19th and 20th centuries, and in particular their physics, have not been sufficiently considered in building up the general 20th century picture of the nature of the universe and of the history of the earth and man. He's saying, whatever your conjecture may be about the reality outside of our perception, right? The fact remains that what you are experiencing, even when you take a microscope and go all the way down to look at the particles, right, is the interaction of some outside world with your senses. Even if your senses are experiencing a marker on a Geiger counter, right, or they are experiencing, some sort of diagram of a thing that you've measured to be at the microscopic level, right? You're still interacting between the matter, the outside stuff, and your mind, right? And he says a better term than particles would possibly be the unrepresented, since anything particular which amounts to a representation will always attract further physical analysis. Moreover, the atoms, protons, and electrons of modern physics are now perhaps more generally regarded not as particles, but as notional models or symbols of an unknown, supersensible, or subsensible base. All I seek to establish in these opening paragraphs is that whatever may be thought about the unrepresented background of our perceptions, the familiar world which we see and know around us, the blue sky with white clouds in it, the noise of a waterfall or a motor bus, the shapes of flowers and their scent, the gesture and utterance of animals and the faces of our friends, the world, too, which, apart from the special inquiry of physics, experts of all kinds methodically investigate, is a system of collective representations. The time comes when one must either accept this as the truth about the world or reject the theories of physics as an elaborate delusion. We cannot have it both ways. This is why I'm always banging on about quantum physics, is because, in fact, right, the implications of quantum physics are exactly this. And Barfield goes on to make the most remarkable observation, which is that we often, when we talk about things like evolution, or what's another one? We talk about the prehistory of the world. We talk as if there were these things going on that can be described exactly as the things that are now going on when we have human consciousness and human perception. He says we find a fossil, say, in the ground, and we infer from this, right, that there was some sort of animal walking around that looked like the bones in this fossil were its skeleton, right? He points out that at the same time as, geology is leading us to these conclusions, physics is leading us to the conclusion that we have no idea what it would have looked like before there was a human consciousness to observe, right? Even things like time. Well, it took however many gajillions of years, right, for this dinosaur, this primordial muck to produce a dinosaur, right? That, too, is basically saying if there had been humans around, then they would have experienced time amounting to this, to this degree, right? And he says, maybe animals have something like our kind of perception too, but a lot of the history of the earth that we talk about when we talk about prehistory is actually based on an idea of the world with no consciousness in it at all, no life in it. And once you eliminate life, you actually render meaningless questions like, well, how long was the thing around? Or what kind of motion was happening? And so when you apply the insights of physics, right, and the effect that our perception has on the measurability of things like distance, space, and time, right, when you apply those insights to the supposed insights of things like geology and prehistory, what you come to realize is that actually the prehistory before the existence of humanity looks a lot more like chaos and darkness upon the void of the depths, right, than we have been led to imagine. He basically says right now we talk in this kind of bifurcated way. In physics, we acknowledge and discover that outside of our perception, reality is kind of formless, or at least we don't know its form or its shape. But then in evolutionary science and in geology, we talk about these periods as if life could go on just in the same way without human consciousness. He's saying we have no idea what was going on before human consciousness came into being, or even the first thing about what it would look like. It becomes meaningless to talk about it. And this is one of the wonderful things about this is it actually kind of resolves a lot of our debates about evolution, right? You may perfectly well say, well, I infer from this fossil that had human beings been around, you would have seen this and this going on. But you also can say from physics that, in fact, we have no way of knowing. I mean, like, one thing you might do with Genesis then is understand it as the description of human consciousness coming into the world, right? That when God creates human consciousness, in some ways, he creates even the prehistory that we infer from the rocks, right? Because he's creating the consciousness that is basically consummating that existence. So yes, perhaps now, right, in retrospect, the Earth has existed for however many gajillions of years. But in point of fact, even talking about it in that language depends upon the existence of the human consciousness. So in some sense, God retroactively creates it when he creates human consciousness. Already, to me, this is one of the most kind of fruitful lines of inquiry, and we haven't even gotten past the introduction. But I want to bring us back now to Barfield, because I've kind of been riffing on him and describing some of the things that I find most exciting in him. Let's get into some of the things that he is concerned with here, because the subtitle of this book is A Study in Idolatry. And his basic contention is going to be that we have this experience of collective representations, right? And that experience, right, is in itself a constituent of reality. In fact, it's the consummation of reality, right? That the things that we as a species together derive from the meeting of our minds with whatever's out there, right? That's just the whole world. That's all that, that's all that we know about. That's all we're talking about. And the fiction that by looking at things at a very small level, we can escape from that idea is the scientistic fiction. It's not, it doesn't render science impotent, but it does mean that a lot of the ways we talk when we talk casually about science are misleading and, in fact, idolatrous, because they confuse a representation that is an experience of something at a very microscopic or indeed macroscopic level with some more fundamentally true reality than the experience we have at the normal human level. It's basically this kind of idea that, truth is to be found in increasingly small or increasingly large investigations of so-called, material fact, right? Fact independent from subjectivity. And what Barfield is saying is there may be such a fact, but it's certainly not what we are discovering. What we're discovering is more and more truth about the subjective relationship between our consciousness and the outside world. So here's another passage that I find intriguing. Let us read it together. The extrasensory participation of the percipient in the representation involves a similar link between the representations themselves and, of course, between one percipient and another. This is why I started out by talking about the relationship between two human minds, that, the reason it is so generative is because, in fact, that's, interrelationship is what we are made for, is kind of like how reality comes to its fullest fruition in us. Mana, or waken, which we can only translate by abstract terms like totemic principle, life principle, or, since it is present also in inanimate objects, being, is anterior to the individuality of persons and objects. These, says Durkheim, he's cribbing here from anthropology, the anthropology of his day, he says, are rather apprehended by the very primitive as stopping places of mana. It is incidentally here that he finds the prototype of the idea of force, which played such a prominent part in the physical science of the 19th century. And in emphasizing the religious origin of the idea, he points out, rather appositely, that Comte regarded the notion of force as a superstition, which was destined to disappear from science, as indeed it has shown marked signs of doing since Durkheim's book was published. So Auguste Comte here, the positivist philosopher who, personally not a big fan of him, but one of the reasons that, he's an apt citation here is because Comte is kind of seeking, he's one of the philosophers that's seeking hardest after so-called objective truth, right? Transcending religion, transcending mythology, and all these notions of subjectivity, and just getting down to the hard and cold facts. And it's interesting that Comte identified force in physics as a fiction, as a kind of mythology. Why is this? Well, Barfield is drawing here on the anthropological idea of the primitive. And I'm not really so concerned about how accurate his understanding was of actual primitive societies, as I am in this notion that, many, let's call them pantheistic religions, do in fact have this notion of a life force, right? That there is kind of being, amorphous, gelatinous being that flows in these different directions and has, incredible energy, but takes on certain shapes in persons and in objects, and that actually our being is kind of a derivative of that kind of being. He's saying this is a kind of primitive intuition of the fact that our consciousnesses are sort of they are the stopping points. They are the places where the things outside of us take on their fullest order and shape. So what we're saying is, there's something out there that causes us to experience the tree. And we might say that without our consciousness, there's some other way that the tree would be. And in fact, in book 2 of the space trilogy, Lewis has the angels say to Ransom, the main character, they take on all these different shapes depending on, how they present themselves to him. And he says, am I now seeing you as you truly are? He says, only Maleldil, only God, sees us as we truly are, which is to say that there may be some way that the tree is in God's perception that is quite different from our conscious perception of it. But what we have, right, is the reality of the tree in God's mind, or in its its sort of abstracted form, filtered through our consciousness, which makes us, right, into the kind of repository of creation as we know it. And this is why, to me, one of the most profound stories in the book of Genesis is the notion that Adam gives names to the animals, because it's saying that man consummates creation by imposing the order that is inherent in the structure of his mind onto the things that God has already made. God makes all of this stuff, but then he invites Adam to finalize that creation. It's one of the central ways that we are in his image, right? That God sees things and that finalizes their creation, right? And God saw that it was good. Then he makes man, right? And man sees things and names them. And naming is a very important concept in Barfield, which I'm now going to get into, the idea of language as the kind of form-giving or shape-giving force. So skipping ahead a little bit in the book here to talk about names. This is from a chapter called The Texture of Medieval Thought. And let's say the medieval way of looking at the world is incredibly important for Barfield because it's a pre-scientific way of looking at the world, not in the sense that there was no such thing as experiment, there was no such thing as looking, at the natural world, natural philosophy, whatever, but that this notion, this kind of fiction we have, which for Barfield is an idolatrous fiction, that there's such a thing as getting down to the bedrock of reality by looking closer and closer at the mechanics of it, had not yet taken hold of the mind. So he says that lost world was a world in which both phenomenon and name were felt as representations. On the one hand, the word conceived in the mind is representative of the whole of that which is realized in thought. He's quoting from Thomas Aquinas here. But on the other hand, the phenomenon itself only achieves full reality in that moment of being named by man. That is, when that in nature which it represents is united with that in man which the name represents. Such naming, however, need not involve vocal utterance, for in the name or word is not mere sound or mere ink. For Aquinas, as for Augustine, there are anterior to the uttered word, the intellect word, the heart word, and the memory word. The human word proceeds from the memory as the divine word proceeds from the Father, proceeds from it, yet remains one with it. This is one of the most profound passages in Aquinas, so it would do well to dwell on it and then to see what use Barfield is making of it. So that last comparison, right? The divine word proceeds from the Father. When we say a word in language, it's very difficult to wrap our heads around this because we're so used to thinking about words as just little tokens that we use in language, right? You sort of move them around on the page or you say them in your mouth. But think about what goes into even learning a word, right? When you are told that there is such a thing as a cat, for instance, as a little child, right? It's impossible to fully reconstruct that experience. But when you're learning a new language, sometimes you can sort of regain this experience when you find a word in a language, in another language that describes that you don't have in your own language. So sometimes people say, like in I think it's in Swedish, the word hygge, sort of like coziness of home. Or there are a number of words in Japanese that are kind of like this, that you can kind of suddenly encounter a word that describes something that you've always had the experience of, but never quite put into words. Weltschmerz is a good one in German, right? World weariness. And so then what's happening is, well, you have encountered the thing, right, that you are experiencing before, that you're learning a word for. You have experienced Weltschmerz, kind of weariness of the world, or at least you've experienced it in others. Um, the pain, the angst of just living in this world. It's been expressed online, you see it, and you might even have a concept of it in your mind as a thing, right? As distinct from other kinds of feelings. And that is something like the verbum intellectus, the intellectual word, the mind word. And the language word that you're getting, you're acquiring in your vocabulary. Is only capable of being used because you already have that language function in your brain that is already creating the space that the word can occupy. And so when you say a word, even a word like cat, right, all you're doing is finalizing, uttering the sense that is already in your mind, that the thing called a cat is different from other animals. And when you see something, you can recognize it as a cat because it fits into that container in your mind that will ultimately be associated with the sound and the letters C-A-T, cat, right? The use of language is a kind of final technology that we use to convey something much more deeply rooted in our consciousness that we're always doing all the time. Reality is this kind of continuous mess, and yet when our minds encounter it, they identify certain true categories. And one of the most important ones that we are currently fighting over is the category of man and woman, right? And this is why, beyond the horrors of, the mutilation of children, beyond the political fights, squabbles that we're having over like the use of bathrooms, the trans craze is actually much deeper than the vanishingly small number of individuals that, experience persistent gender dysphoria. What it's much more truly about is the nature of words, right? And are we able to cogently say that a man is a thing and a woman is a thing? And the argument against that from the postmodernists is always, well, look at these, intersex individuals, or look at these few people who have different chromosomal patterns. And you can always chip away if you say, well, a man has these, genitalia, then what about castrated men? And if you say, well, there are these chromosomes, what about this person with 3 chromosomes? And that is an assault on the language using function full stop, which is to say we are able actually to experience categories even though there is always an exception to any marker of that category. You can always find an exception on the edge. But if that exception means that there's no such thing as the category, then language doesn't work at all. And anything can be anything that you want it to be, which is why trans has become a whole mode of thought. It's not just about gender anymore, right? It's about transing, the queering space and queering, the way that we deal with literature. And all of that just means kind of dissolving boundaries between things, which is a recipe for chaos, because the only thing that exists in reality is the imposition of human order, the meeting of the order inherent in the human mind with the outside world and its kind of unknowable chaos. This is the stuff in Barfield that to me is just like, you have to kind of chip away at it to get there. But it's so urgent. And I'm going to talk now about one of the ways in which it's particularly urgent I've been hinting at, and that is its relationship with scientism of the kind that we have encountered a great deal over the past few years. How would you like to drink great tea and fight back against wokeness at the same time? Now you can with Gold River Trading Company. I have been singing the praises, sometimes literally singing the praises of Gold River tea for a while now. But something you might not know about this company, which is really exciting, is that they are explicitly anti-woke. They are Christian, they are pro-America, they believe in freedom, and that means that when you buy their tea, you are not giving money to people who hate you. This is the worst part about the politicization of everything, is that in the woke revolution, you always have to be asking yourself, am I giving money to people that think that I should be shut down, that my speech should be policed, that I need to, be on constant lock, that I'm a quote unquote semi-fascist? Gold River does not think any of those things. That's why their brand is the way they are. I mean, come on, their big tea is the 1776 American breakfast blend. And it's good too, man. It is really delicious. There's a lot of great teas that you can check out, including some decaffeinated or non-caffeinated options, plus all those flavorful classics that you know and love at goldriverco.com. And you can now save more with them. You save 15% on all orders using the discount code Heretics. That's 15% off at goldriverco.com when you use the discount code Heretics. So I want to talk now as a way of getting into this Barfieldian insight into science and scientism. I want to talk now about the meaning of the title, Saving the Appearances. It's a quote of a Greek phrase, sos dein ta phenomena. And we should talk about what each of those words mean. Most importantly, phenomena. I guess ta actually is just the, right? So it's just the definite article. But phenomena from a verb, phino, is the thing which appears, right? And it appears to somebody. It has a kind of middle voice force, which is to say, in Greek, you have the active voice and the passive voice. Active voice, something I do to you. Passive voice, something that is done to me. And middle voice, something that I do that has an effect on me, or a kind of reflexive behavior. And so when something is a phenomenon, which is where we get our word phenomenon, it's something that emanates out of an outside thing that nevertheless affects our awareness of that thing. It's like the sensory perception that I was talking about in Plato, where he says it's at a third degree of remove from reality because it has this it's kind of an emanation out of a thing that is already a kind of derivation from a form. So something like I see the sun revolve around the Earth. That's a phenomenon because you might say, well, the sun doesn't really revolve around the Earth, right? But I'm saying, well, I'm having that is the phenomenon, and it's explicable with reference to the thing that is the sun and its behavior in other contexts. If I flew, outside into space, I would see a different kind of motion, but I would still be able to understand why I have experienced the sun moving around the Earth. That's that phenomenon, right? And making that kind of explanation is what's meant by sos dein ta phenomena, saving the appearances. And Barfield's basic idea is that natural philosophy and astronomy and these kind of ancient practices that eventually gave rise to, or you might say gave way to, modern science, were designed to sos dein ta phenomena. We were here to develop models of how things are related to one another in space and time that can rescue, right, our experience of them in our day-to-day life. So if I see the sun revolving around the Earth, but then I make certain calculations that indicate that actually the Earth is revolving around the sun, how can I save the phenomena, right? How can I develop a system of calculation that nevertheless accounts for the fact that the sun revolves around the Earth? And here is what Barfield says about the Copernican revolution, right? Which is this decision ultimately to regard the Earth as revolving around the sun, which I think is incredibly suggestive. He says, unless we realize, with the help of a little historical excavation, what from the epistemological point of view astronomy then signified, and had signified for about 2,000 years, we shall not understand the real significance of Copernicus and Galileo. The popular view is that Copernicus discovered that the Earth moves around the sun. Actually, the hypothesis that the Earth revolves around the sun is at least as old as the 3rd century BC, when it was advanced by Aristarchus of Samos, and he was neither the only nor probably the first astronomer to think of it. Copernicus himself knew this. Secondly, it is generally believed that the Church tried to keep the discovery dark. Actually, Copernicus did not himself want to publish his De Revolutionibus Orbium, and was only eventually prevailed on to do so by the importunity of 2 eminent churchmen. The real turning point in the history of astronomy and of science in general was something else altogether. It took place when Copernicus, probably, it cannot be regarded as certain, began to think, and others like Kepler and Galileo began to affirm that the heliocentric hypothesis not only saved the appearances, but was physically true. It was this novel idea that the Copernican and therefore any other hypothesis might not be a hypothesis at all, but the ultimate truth that was almost enough in itself to constitute the scientific revolution of which Professor Butterfield has written. He's citing here Herbert Butterfield, which I'm going to get back to in a second. This is Cambridge series of lectures on the birth of science. It outshines everything, says Butterfield, since the rise of Christianity, and reduces the Renaissance and Reformation to the rank of mere episodes, mere internal displacements within the system of medieval Christendom. When the ordinary man hears that the Church told Galileo that he might teach Copernicanism as a hypothesis, which saved all the celestial phenomena satisfactorily, but not as being the truth, he laughs. But this was really how Ptolemaic astronomy had been taught. In its place in history, it was not a casuistical quibble. It was the refusal, unjustified it may be, to allow the introduction of a new and momentous doctrine. It was not simply a new theory of the nature of the celestial movements that was feared, but a new theory of the nature of theory, namely that if a hypothesis saves all the appearances, it is identical with truth. And he cites Aquinas as a kind of authority for this idea. It's really crucial that we understand this, that the problem or the error that science introduces into the world, even as it opens our eyes to all sorts of new truths, right? The misconception that it is liable to give rise to is the idea that some sort of physical reality, some configuration of things in space, is a kind of bedrock of reality, independent of our human consciousness, independent of our standpoint and our way of looking at things, and therefore more true than some other thing that we alone can perceive like beauty, right? The idea that the physical world is more real than the world of morality or the world of memory or the world of desire, right, comes from this notion that we can, by describing things mathematically in a way that coheres, we have therefore identified some final bedrock and stop of reality. And this is what Plato also is contesting when he says that looking upward doesn't just mean looking physically at the sky, right? He's saying actually there is something behind even the motion of the heavens, even if we find more elegant and more accurate ways to describe the motions of the heavens and predict the motions of the heavens. What we've really done is we've achieved a certain level of what Barfield calls dashboard knowledge. We know how our representations are going to behave, but we have not penetrated beyond the veil of our representations, which is what we sort of think we've done. We sort of have this common misconception that by getting better scientific analysis, we're getting beyond the sort of subjective encounter of the human mind with reality, which enables us to perpetuate the fiction that there's something called objective truth that has nothing to do with our human subjectivity. And then there's subjective truth, which isn't really true at all, or at best is kind of true for you, and whatever you say about it can be true. And this gives rise to the kind of parallel thought that, well, if I find something beautiful and you find it ugly, there's no way of adjudicating between those two things. There's no truth about beauty, and what it's just whatever you happen to like. You do you, man. And this bifurcation, this split between so-called objective truth, which is merely physical, and so-called purely subjective truth, which is all the stuff that we can just kind of dismiss as irrelevant or having no authority, or at least just being, purely arbitrary. I mean, usually when we say the word subjective, we mean arbitrary, right? This is the problem that science has introduced into our consciousness, is the misconception that science gives rise to that becomes scientism, that becomes the worship of science. Because, of course, if you decide that only the things that science discovers are really or objectively or finally true, independent of our consciousness, whatever that means, right? If you decide that, then you're going to locate all kinds of truth in science. You're going to decide that science gives a full and exhaustive account of the world. So to kind of close this part, we're going to continue, I think, with Barfield for a little while, and we're going to keep talking about some of these ideas because they are so important. But I would like to cite my own self, if you don't mind. A lot of this is going to be in the book How to Save the West, which you can pre-order. I think you guys will really like it. But I also, and I have to toot my own horn here a little bit, I am on the cover of the New Claremont Review of books, which I said this online, but this is an actual dream come true. This is something that I have actually, like, if you had told 25-year-old me that this was going to be a thing, I would have been like, no way, never in a million years, because I was such a fanboy of CRB, as indeed I still am, even now that I work there. So I am super delighted about this. And it turns out that the essay that I wrote for CRB that's on the cover, which is about the multiverse, has some passages in it that are directly related to this. So let me just read to you a little bit of this essay. So the essay is called Worlds Without End, and it's about the multiverse in Marvel comics and movies and in modern science and so on and so forth. But here's the passage that I just wanted to read to you because it is in some sense inspired by some of the thoughts I had reading Barfield. A pervasive modern assumption is that science has displaced metaphysics and religion as the definitive story about who we are and why we are here. It was Darwin who first put together a coherent and tenable account of why we exist, wrote the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene. He went on to quote with approval the paleontologist G.G. Simpson, "All attempts to answer that question before 1859 are worthless, and we will be better off if we ignore them completely." Dawkins and his fellow new atheists did much to popularize the idea that Aristotle, Plato, Moses, Christ, Muhammad, and their ilk are obsolete in light of scientific discovery. If mathematical laws of the physical world can furnish an exhaustive picture of reality, then all life's meaning is to be found through scientific experiment and theory. Naturally, then, science fiction is the type of art that can tell us most about man's nature and destiny. And that, to me, is one of the most important implications of what Barfield is saying, re Copernicus, that it splits the world into objective and true and physical on the one hand, and subjective and arbitrary and spiritual or emotional on the other hand. And this is a false division because both of those categories of experience, although they relate to different faculties of the soul, one having to do with sensory experience, another having to do with sort of higher psychic reasoning, nevertheless, right, are bound up with the encounter of our soul, of our consciousness with the outside world. And neither one gets us at the kind of God's eye view that science is promising to offer us. This is why science is becoming such a religion. It's because it's promising to offer us the God's eye view, the view of things independent of our dirty, nasty human consciousness and bodies and so on and so forth. It's not doing that. What it's doing is saving the appearances, right? It's using our increasingly advanced perceptive and measuring faculties to tell us, truths about how the outside world, of which we have no inhuman experience, but only human relationship, how the outside world interacts with us and can be used to our advantage. And that key point is the last thing I want to read to you today from Barfield. This is his sort of description of what what he calls dashboard knowledge, which I mentioned earlier. So here it is. He's talking here about Francis Bacon, who's a good example of somebody that thinks of science as precisely this kind of utilitarian tool, right, for manipulating the world, irrespective of our understanding of it, right? He says, take a clever boy who knows nothing about the principle of internal combustion or the inside of an engine and leave him inside a motor car, first telling him to move the various knobs, switches, and levers about and see what happens. If no disaster supervenes, he will end by finding himself able to drive the car. It will then be true to say that he knows how to drive the car, but untrue to say that he knows the car. As to that, the most we could say would be that he has an operative knowledge of it, because for operation, all that is required is a good empirical acquaintance with the dashboard and the pedals. Whatever we say, it is obvious that what he has is very different from the knowledge of someone else who has studied mechanics, internal combustion, and the construction of motor cars, though he has perhaps never driven a car in his life and is perhaps too nervous to try. Now, whether or no there is another kind of knowledge of nature which corresponds to engine knowledge in the analogy, it seems that if the first view of the nature of scientific theory is accepted, the kind of knowledge aimed at by science must be, in effect, what I will call dashboard knowledge. He's saying if we have some kind of knowledge that amounts to getting at the inner workings of the universe, which produce our experiences and our representation, it's probably something more like philosophy, right? Which has to do with, the abstract truths and categories that give rise to our physical experiences. Science is telling us how to have a more and more granular physical experience, more and more precise physical experience, but not, importantly, how to get at some more underlying, more bedrock truth than the truth we have in our day-to-day life when we experience the realities of the soul. This is so important. This stuff is so crucial, you guys. And I would highly recommend reading Saving the Appearances by Owen Barfield. I would also humbly recommend reading my essay, Worlds Without End, which you can find at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com. We're going to keep talking about this stuff, but for now, let's do the mailbag. It is so important to have your finances on lock, and Rocket Money can help you with basically anything you need, especially canceling unwanted subscriptions. If you've been following the show for a while, you already know and love Rocket Money under their former name, which was Truebill, but they've been growing and growing. And now that they have rebranded as Rocket Money, they are going to help you do all the same things they used to and more. They help you manage and cancel subscriptions you don't need, want, or simply forgot about. They also help you to budget and lower bills. They save their members on average $700 a year. That is incredible savings. They have a proven track record working with over 3.4 million people. I thoroughly recommend them. I just recently went through a kind of revision of my finances because I got married. And then when you mix your finances together, you have to think holistically about, your savings and all of your bank accounts and whatever. And it helps so much to have an app like Rocket Money around. When you go to rocketmoney.com/heretics, you can start getting your finances in order as well. It's rocketmoney.com/heretics. That's rocketmoney.com/heretics. Mailbag questions come to me on locals. You can go to youngheretics.com/locals to find this incredible community of VIPs. It's sort of a more elaborate and extensive engagement in a community with these ideas that we're talking about on the show. How do I apply them to my life? How can I use them to understand modern politics and so forth? I write essays there that you can only get on locals. I do little book reviews and translations. And we do a weekly live stream, which I really love. It's sort of a back and forth, a chance to sit down together over a drink and talk about some of this stuff. Go to youngheretics.com/locals to become a member, a VIP, and then you can be in the mailbag, just like Antisocial Critic. Here's his question. What are your thoughts on Curtis Yarvin, the Dark Enlightenment, and the Cathedral as a concept to describe the growth of leftist ideas? It seems to be becoming a more popular way to read the problems of the political establishment, namely that we have a garbage in, garbage out problem at the civilizational level, and that society needs more formalized hierarchies so that they don't develop incorrect ideas about how free they truly are, while the government slides into oligarchy and quiet tyranny. It's a very compelling idea, but there also seems to be a lingering danger in the prescriptions for addressing these symptoms, a la far-right revolution, neo-monarchism, etc. What are your thoughts? Well, Yarvin has been much in the news these days, both come under a lot of attack, but also gained a lot of applause. One of the first things that I ever did at the American Mind was help to publish him in TAM. The Clear Pill, I think, was the essay that he wrote for us. And so, I find his stuff very interesting. I have no animus toward him. He's not, I don't agree with him. He's not quite on the same page as I am. And that is because it seems to me that this idea of the cathedral is describing a real truth, but doing so in a way that sort of takes this posture of cynicism. It's kind of like, using James Burnham and the Machiavellians to say, well, there's only three kinds of government, right? And if you don't like the way that our democracy is going, it's sort of becoming an oligarchy, essentially. And therefore you have to, acquiesce to a monarchy. And the cathedral is sort of this oligarchy that is coming into being. And it's not a new idea in the sense that, Claremont typically talks about this stuff more like the ruling class, right? Which is something we get from Angelo Codevilla. James Burnham, also somebody famous for talking about the theory of oligarchy. And I think you would be hard-pressed to deny that such a thing exists, right? I mean, that's obviously a thing. One of the things that I've been arguing is that you certainly can't escape the existence of an aristocratic class. There's always going to be, whether it exists via hereditary, whether it's hereditary or whether it's meritocratic or some combination of both, you're always going to have a kind of group of people that operate at the highest levels of society. And yes, part of my critique also of the current American situation is that our aristocratic class is corrupt and decadent. And there's no question to me that that's true. So in that sense, I understand. And I think that the cathedral kind of makes it seem a little bit more competent and organized than it actually is. Like, I think that really we're dealing with a number of incentives more akin to what Plato describes in Book 8 of the Republic, and that these things kind of emerge naturally out of time and the decay of Republican systems. But it seems to me that, it's not the case that you only have, even Machiavelli himself would say it's not the case that you only have oligarchy, monarchy, and democracy. You also have a republic. Like, a republic is a thing, and it's both in classical and in modern political philosophy. It is the solution to these problems. Now, does that mean that we're going to be able to recover and reclaim our republic? No. Does it mean that we need to insist to people that their republic is at a further stage of advanced decay than perhaps they, in their complacency, have admitted? Yes, absolutely. So I will go that far. But I think that there is this kind of just knowing cynicism, this like self-indulgent, well, it's just all going, unfortunately, we just have to take over because we're the competent ones. It's like, there's really not a lot of competence in evidence among our present elites. There's a lot of power and a lot of, a lot of corruption and these sorts of things, but none of it gives me any faith that like, the best solution to that is simply to anoint like somebody in Silicon Valley king, right? And just make him a wise, enlightened monarch. Like, I'm not so anti-monarchy that I think it always and everywhere sucks, but I also think that the problems that we're addressing are problems specifically of Republican decay, not democratic decay. This is not like, we do have some democratic excesses, but our problem is not that we've, decayed in the way that a democracy decays. We've decayed in the way that a republic decays, which is into an oligarchy. And that means that the remedy is restoration of Republican ideals. And if that's not our remedy, then we've just given up, essentially. That's my sort of take on it. And there's obviously a lot more to say, but I would say that's kind of top line. You asked me for what's my assessment of this stuff. I think it's worth engaging with. I hate when it gets talked about as if it were some sort of like neo-fascist, something untouchable that we can't even deign to understand because that would taint us or whatever. But it's not quite my theory of the case, nor is it something that I wish personally to align myself with. Because the other last thing I'll say is whenever somebody says to you that unfortunately we've run the numbers and it just turns out that you actually can't have your republic. That's just everybody always says that. Like, there's always some reason why, like, the hour is too late, and unfortunately, we just have to do a monarchy now. Like, that's one of the oldest tricks in the book. And as an American, I feel like my job is to be like, you know what? We're gonna do it. We're gonna do it. Damn it. Okay, that's what I have to say. Don't forget to subscribe to the show if you are listening to my voice and you're liking this. Share. Let people know, give us a 5-star review on Google or Apple Music or YouTube, or I guess you can't do 5 stars on YouTube, but you can on Spotify now. So give us 5 stars wherever you can. Anyone who will listen, some guy, buttonhole some guy on the street and tell him about Young Heretics. Spread the word, and please do subscribe so that you won't miss an episode. I will see you next week. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute where I work. You can find us at ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, AmericanMind.org, and you can donate at Claremont.org/donate. As I mentioned, I'm on the cover of the new CRB, but there's plenty of other stuff by other people, many of them much wiser and smarter than me, to be found at Claremont. Come join us over there. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.